The coffee cup trembled violently in his weathered hands, dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. From a nearby table, a young man in a Marine Corps t-shirt elbowed his buddy and nodded toward the elderly man. "Hey, check out Grandpa over there. Looks like he's trying to start an earthquake with that coffee." The group of 4 young Marines erupted in laughter, not bothering to keep their voices down. The old man heard every word. His hands continued to shake, the tremors beyond his control, a condition he'd lived with for over a decade. But his eyes, still sharp despite his 78 years, remained fixed on his cup. He didn't respond. He didn't turn around. He simply raised the trembling cup to his lips, took a slow sip and set it back down with the same deliberate patience he'd shown in every challenge life had thrown at him. What those young Marines didn't know was that in less than 2 hours, they would watch those same shaky hands do something that would shake them to their core. If you believe that true strength isn't always visible to the eye, type respect in the comments below. Walter Keane had been coming to Rosie's Diner every Saturday morning for the past 18 years. It was a ritual that had started with his wife Dorothy, who had loved their blueberry pancakes and had insisted they make it a weekly tradition. When Dorothy passed away 7 years ago, Walter had continued coming alone. Same booth by the window, same order, black coffee and a single blueberry pancake in her memory. Same quiet hour of reflection before he headed to the shooting range for his weekly practice. The waitresses all knew him by name. They knew to bring his coffee without asking, knew to give him space during his meal, knew that the slight tremor in his hands wasn't something to comment on or pity. To them, Walter Keane was simply a fixture of Saturday mornings, as reliable as the sunrise and twice as welcome. The tremors had started 12 years ago, a cruel gift from a neurological condition that the doctors said would only get worse with time. Essential tremor, they called it, a disorder that caused involuntary shaking, particularly in the hands, that intensified with purposeful movement. It wasn't Parkinson's, though many people assumed it was. It wasn't life-threatening, though it had certainly changed his life. Simple tasks that most people took for granted, like buttoning a shirt, signing his name, or holding a cup of coffee, had become daily challenges. Walter had adapted, as he always had. He'd learned to work around the tremors, to compensate with technique and patience for what his nervous system no longer provided naturally. But adaptation didn't mean acceptance. Every trembling hand, every spilled drink, every pitying look from strangers reminded him of what he'd lost. The Marines at the nearby table were loud, boisterous, full of the confidence that came with youth and physical fitness, and the knowledge that they served their country. Walter didn't begrudge them that confidence. He'd had it himself once, decades ago, when his hands were steady as iron and his body could do anything he demanded of it. He remembered what it felt like to be young and strong and invincible, to look at older people and assume their weakness was a character flaw rather than an inevitability. These young men would learn eventually. Time taught everyone the same lessons. He just hoped they'd learn with more grace than they were currently displaying. "Seriously though," one of the Marines said, loud enough for half the diner to hear, "can you imagine trying to qualify with hands like that? He'd probably shoot himself in the foot." More laughter. A waitress shot the table a disapproving look, but the young men didn't notice or didn't care. "My grandfather had the shakes like that," another one added. "We had to take his car keys away. Couldn't even hold the steering wheel straight." The first Marine snorted. "That old guy probably hasn't held anything straight in 20 years. Probably has to sit down to take a—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. The table dissolved into crude laughter. Walter finished his coffee. He set the cup down with both hands, steadying it against the table to minimize the tremor. He left a $20 bill beside his plate, the same generous tip he left every week, and slowly rose to his feet. His movements were careful and deliberate, not because he was afraid of falling, but because he had learned that rushing only made the tremors worse. He collected his jacket from the hook beside the booth, shouldered the long rifle case he'd set against the wall, and made his way toward the exit. As he passed the Marine's table, one of them made an exaggerated shaking motion with his hands, drawing fresh laughter from his companions. Walter didn't acknowledge them. He simply pushed through the door and walked out into the morning sunshine, the bell above the entrance chiming softly behind him. The Veterans Memorial Shooting Complex was a 20-minute drive from the diner, though Walter no longer drove himself. His nephew Marcus picked him up every Saturday, a kindness that Walter appreciated more than he could express. Marcus had offered to take him to a closer range, one that didn't require such a long trip, but Walter had refused. This range was special. It was where he'd spent countless hours over the decades, where he'd trained, practiced, and maintained the skills that had once made him extraordinary. The staff knew him. The facilities accommodated his needs. Most importantly, the long-distance rifle range was one of the best in the state, and Walter Keene had not survived 78 years to settle for second best. Marcus dropped him off at the entrance with a promise to return in 3 hours. Walter made his way inside, nodding to the familiar faces at the check-in desk, collecting his lane assignment and heading toward the rifle range with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. The range was busier than usual today. A group of young shooters had reserved several lanes for what looked like an informal competition, their gear expensive and their attitudes competitive. Walter paid them no mind. He had lane 12, his preferred spot, and that was all that mattered. He was setting up his equipment when he heard the voices, loud, confident, achingly familiar. Walter looked up and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The 4 Marines from the diner had just entered the rifle range. They were carrying their own gear, dressed now in workout clothes rather than casual wear, but there was no mistaking them. The same swagger, the same volume, the same assumption that the world existed for their entertainment. They hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy bantering with each other, debating who would outshoot whom, making wagers that Walter suspected would never actually be paid. They took lanes 8, 9, 10, and 11, directly adjacent to Walter's position. The first Marine, the one who had made the earthquake joke at the diner, was the first to spot him. Walter saw the recognition flash across his face, saw the elbow jab to his nearest companion, saw the suppressed grins as word spread through the group. Great, they were probably thinking. The shaky old man followed us here. This should be entertaining. Walter ignored them. He had work to do. He opened his rifle case and began the methodical process of preparing his weapon, a custom-built precision rifle that he'd owned for over 30 years. His hands trembled as they always did, making the process slower than it would have been for someone else. But Walter had learned to work with his condition, not against it. Every movement was deliberate, every adjustment carefully executed despite the constant involuntary motion. The Marines, meanwhile, had begun their own shooting. They were using standard military rifles, well maintained but nothing special, firing at targets set at 300 yards. For trained Marines, this should have been routine. But Walter noticed something as he watched them from his peripheral vision. They weren't hitting their marks, not consistently anyway. Their groupings were scattered, their consistency poor, their technique adequate but uninspired. They were competent shooters, certainly, but they were not exceptional. They had learned to fire a weapon, but they had not learned to become one with it. There was a difference, and Walter knew that difference intimately. One of the Marines, frustrated by a particularly poor grouping, slammed his hand against the shooting bench. "This rifle is garbage," he complained. "The sights are off." His companion laughed. "The sights aren't off, Davis. Your aim is off. Maybe you should ask the old man for tips." This drew laughter from the group, and several glances were thrown in Walter's direction. Walter continued preparing his rifle, giving no indication that he'd heard. Let them laugh. Let them joke. His hands might shake, but his focus was unwavering. A range safety officer approached the Marines' lanes. His name was Sergeant Major Thomas Patterson, retired Army, a man who had seen more combat than these young Marines could imagine. He watched their shooting for a moment, his expression carefully neutral. "You boys having trouble today?" The first Marine, the one called Davis, shrugged with forced casualness. "Just warming up, Sergeant Major. These rental rifles aren't exactly top-notch." Patterson's eyebrow rose almost imperceptibly. "Those are standard issue M27s. Same rifles you qualified with at Pendleton, I'd imagine." He paused. "The problem isn't the equipment, son. It's the fundamentals. You're anticipating your shots, jerking the trigger instead of squeezing it. Your breathing is erratic, and you're all hunching your shoulders like you're trying to protect yourselves from the recoil." He shook his head. "Basic errors. The kind of errors that get people killed in actual combat." The Marines exchanged uncomfortable glances. Being corrected was one thing. Being corrected by a retired Army NCO in front of their peers was something else entirely. Davis, clearly the leader of the group, bristled visibly. "With respect, Sergeant Major, Marine Corps marksmanship training is the best in the world. We know what we're doing." Patterson's expression didn't change. "Then I'd suggest you start showing it. Because right now, What I'm seeing is 4 young men who think they're better than they are." He turned and walked away before any of them could respond, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Walter had finished preparing his rifle. He settled into his shooting position, adjusting his body with the same methodical precision he'd shown in every movement. His target was set at 800 yards, more than twice the distance the Marines were shooting. The wind was light but variable, the kind of conditions that separated good shooters from great ones. Walter took a breath, feeling the familiar rhythm of preparation settle over him. His hands trembled against the rifle stock. His finger shook as it found the trigger, but something changed when he looked through the scope. Some switch flipped in his brain, some compensation mechanism that he'd developed over decades of practice. The tremors didn't stop, but they faded into the background, becoming noise that his mind filtered out. His focus narrowed to a single point, the center of the target 800 yards away. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and clean. 800 yards downrange, the target registered a perfect center hit. Walter chambered another round without looking up, his hands still trembling, his movements still deliberate. He fired again. Another perfect hit so close to the first that the holes nearly touched. Then another. Then another. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits, a grouping that would have impressed Olympic champions. The Marines had stopped shooting. They were staring at Walter's lane, at his target, at the impossible accuracy they were witnessing. Davis's mouth hung open. His companion, the one who had suggested asking the old man for tips, looked like he might be sick. They had watched Walter's hands shake as he set up his equipment. They had seen the tremors as he loaded his rifle. They had assumed, as so many people assumed, that those shaky hands meant weakness, meant incompetence, meant that this old man had no business being on a shooting range. They had been spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. Sergeant Major Patterson had returned, drawn by the sound of Walter's shooting. He stood behind Walter's lane, watching with an expression that had shifted from neutrality to something approaching reverence. When Walter paused to reload, Patterson spoke quietly. "Good to see you still have it, Master Sergeant." Walter glanced back at him, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered features. "Thomas, didn't know you were working here now." Patterson nodded. "Started last spring. Needed something to do with my retirement. Figured this was better than golf." He paused. "I see the tremors haven't slowed you down much." Walter looked at his shaking hands. "They slow me down plenty, but they don't stop me. Never have, never will." Davis had approached, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "Excuse me, sir. That shooting you just did. Those groupings at 800 yards. How is that possible? Your hands are—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of how rude the question might sound. Walter turned to face him fully. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, studied the young Marine with an intensity that made Davis want to step backward. "My hands shake," Walter said simply. "They've been shaking for 12 years. Neurological condition. Doctors said it would only get worse, and they were right." He held up one trembling hand for emphasis. "But I've been shooting for 60 years. Started when I was 18, just like you. Served my country for 32 of those years. Spent most of that time as a sniper." The word hung in the air. Sniper! Davis felt the blood drain from his face. His companions, who had drifted closer to hear the conversation, exchanged looks of dawning realization. This wasn't just some old man with the shakes. This was someone who had trained to kill from distances most people couldn't comprehend. Someone who had spent decades developing skills that transcended the limitations of his body. Someone whose trembling hands had once held lives in their grip. Patterson stepped forward. "Allow me to introduce Master Sergeant Walter Keene, retired, United States Army Special Operations, 114 confirmed kills across 3 conflicts, including Vietnam, Grenada and the Gulf War. Recipient of 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. Holder of the Army's long-range marksmanship record from 1987 to 2003. He paused, letting the information sink in. "Master Sergeant Keene trained more snipers than I can count. Half the instructors at Quantico studied his techniques. The breathing methods you were taught in boot camp. He helped develop them. The trigger discipline your drill instructors hammered into you. Based on his research." Davis looked like he might collapse. His companions weren't faring much better. The memories of the diner came flooding back. The jokes about the earthquake, the comments about taking away car keys, the crude implication about his bathroom habits. They had mocked this man. They had laughed at him. They had assumed his trembling hands made him less than them, weak and useless and worthy only of ridicule. And now they were standing in front of a legend, a warrior whose accomplishments dwarfed anything they had achieved or would likely ever achieve. "Sir," Davis began, his voice cracking, "this morning at the diner as we didn't know. I mean, we shouldn't have—" He couldn't finish. The shame was too heavy, the words too inadequate. What could he possibly say that would make up for what they'd done? Walter studied the young Marine for a long moment. He remembered what it felt like to be young and foolish, to make mistakes that seemed catastrophic in the moment. He remembered mentors who had shown him grace when he didn't deserve it, who had corrected him without crushing him, who had helped him become the man he was today. He could crush these young men with a word. He could report their behavior to their commanding officer, could ensure that their careers suffered for their disrespect. He could walk away without a word and let them stew in their shame forever. But that wasn't who Walter Keene had ever been. "Come here," he said, gesturing Davis toward his shooting position. "All of you, line up." The Marines obeyed instantly, their earlier swagger completely absent. They stood at attention, instinctively responding to the authority in Walter's voice despite his advanced age. Walter looked at each of them in turn. "You want to know how I shoot like this with hands that won't stop shaking? I'll tell you. It's not talent. It's not some secret technique that the Army keeps hidden from the Marine Corps." A hint of humour entered his voice at that last part, and the tension eased slightly. "It's practice. Thousands and thousands of hours of practice. It's learning to work with your body instead of against it. It's understanding that your limitations don't define you. They challenge you, and challenges are meant to be overcome." He pointed at Davis's rifle. "Pick that up. Show me your stance." Davis complied, settling into the shooting position he'd been taught in basic training. Walter circled him slowly, studying his form with the same analytical precision he'd once used to read wind patterns across Afghan valleys. "Your shoulders are too high. You're fighting the rifle instead of becoming part of it. Drop them. Relax." Davis adjusted. "Better. Now you're breathing. You're holding your breath before you shoot, which seems logical but actually increases your heart rate and makes your hands less steady. Try this instead." He demonstrated a breathing pattern, slow and rhythmic. Breathe in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. Shoot during the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale. That's when your body is stillest. For the next 2 hours, Walter Keene did what he had done for 32 years in uniform. He taught. He worked with each of the 4 Marines individually, correcting their stance, adjusting their grip, refining their breathing, teaching them the fundamental techniques that separated adequate shooters from excellent ones. His hands trembled throughout, but his instructions were precise, his demonstrations flawless, his patience seemingly infinite. The Marines listened with an intensity they had rarely shown in official training sessions. They weren't just learning from an instructor, they were learning from a master, a man who had forgotten more about marksmanship than they would ever know. By the end of the session, their groupings had improved dramatically. Davis, who had been the most vocal critic of his rifle's supposedly faulty sights, was now hitting centre mass with consistency he hadn't achieved since qualification. His companions were showing similar improvement. More importantly, their attitudes had transformed completely. Gone was the arrogance, the mockery, the assumption that youth and physical fitness made them superior. In its place was something closer to humility, the understanding that mastery came in many forms and that appearances could be deceiving. As the Marines prepared to leave, Davis approached Walter one last time. "Master Sergeant Keene, sir, I need to apologise. What we said at the diner this morning, it was disrespectful, it was wrong, and not just because of who you are or what you've accomplished." He took a breath. "It was wrong because you're a person, because you deserve basic dignity and respect regardless of whether your hands shake or not. We forgot that. I forgot that, and I'm sorry." Walter looked at the young man, seeing not the arrogant fool from that morning, but someone who was trying, genuinely trying, to be better. That was all anyone could ask. "An apology means something only if behaviour changes," Walter said. "You can tell me you're sorry all day long, but if you walk out of here and mock the next old person you see, what have you learned?" He held Davis's gaze. "I'm going to give you the same advice my drill sergeant gave me 58 years ago, and it's the most important thing anyone has ever told me. Every person you meet knows something you don't. Every single one. The homeless man on the corner might know what it feels like to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. The elderly woman in the coffee shop might know what it means to love someone for 60 years and lose them. The guy with the shaky hands might know how to put a bullet through a target at 1,000 yards. He let that sink in. You'll never know what someone can teach you if you dismiss them before they have a chance to speak. Davis nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I understand. Sir? Walter allowed himself a small smile. Good. Now get out of here. Go practice what I taught you. And the next time you see someone who looks like they need help, ask yourself what they might be able to teach you before you decide what you can teach them. The Marines departed with handshakes and thank yous, their earlier bravado replaced by a subdued respect that would stay with them far longer than any lecture or punishment could have achieved. Patterson watched them go, then turned to Walter with an expression of quiet admiration. You didn't have to do that. Most people wouldn't have. Walter shrugged, beginning to pack up his equipment with those same trembling hands. Most people don't understand that kindness is a choice, not a weakness. Those boys made a mistake. They were disrespectful and cruel, but they were also young and stupid, which is a temporary condition that time usually fixes. He closed his rifle case. I could have humiliated them. I could have reported them. I could have let them stew in their shame without offering them a path forward. But what would that have accomplished? 4 young men who went home feeling terrible about themselves, learning nothing except that they got caught. He looked at Patterson. I'd rather they go home better than when they came in. I'd rather they remember this day not as the day they got embarrassed, but as the day they learned something valuable. That's how you change people, Thomas. Not by punishing their mistakes, but by showing them a better way. 6 months later, Walter received a letter. It was from Davis, now stationed overseas on his first deployment. The letter was long and heartfelt, filled with details about how the lessons he'd learned that day at the range had made him a better shooter, a better Marine, and a better person. He wrote about an incident just weeks into his deployment, when he'd come across an elderly Afghan man being disrespected by some of his fellow soldiers. He'd stepped in, reminded them that appearances could be deceiving, and later learned that the old man was a village elder, whose cooperation was crucial to their mission. That single act of respect, Davis wrote, had probably saved lives. At the bottom of the letter was a simple request: permission to share Walter's story with his unit, to use it as an example of why respect mattered, why humility mattered, why the greatest warriors were often the ones who didn't look the part. Walter wrote back with his blessing. The letter became something of a legend within Davis's unit, passed from soldier to soldier, shared during quiet moments between missions. The story of the old man with the shaky hands who could outshoot anyone evolved into a reminder that strength took many forms, that mastery transcended physical limitations, and that every person deserved basic respect until they proved otherwise. Young Marines who heard the story began looking at elderly people differently. They started asking questions instead of making assumptions. They started learning instead of mocking. Walter Keane continued his Saturday routine for another 3 years. Coffee at Rosie's Diner. Practice at the range. The same booth, the same order, the same unwavering discipline that had defined his entire life. The tremors got worse, as the doctors had predicted, but his shooting remained remarkable. He adapted, compensated, refused to surrender to the limitations his body tried to impose. On the morning of his 81st birthday, surrounded by friends and former students who had travelled from across the country to celebrate, Walter fired his final shot at the range. It was a 1,000-yard shot, the longest of his career, executed with hands that shook so badly he could barely load the rifle. The shot hit dead centre. Of course it did. He passed away 6 months later, peacefully, in the same house he'd shared with Dorothy for 43 years. His funeral was attended by hundreds, soldiers and veterans, students and colleagues, friends and family, who had been touched by his quiet wisdom and extraordinary skill. Davis, now a staff sergeant himself, delivered the eulogy. He spoke about that morning at the diner, about the cruel jokes and the humiliating laughter, about the lesson he'd learned on the range and how it had shaped his entire career. He spoke about kindness as a choice, about respect as a foundation, about the responsibility that came with strength. Master Sergeant Keane could have destroyed us that day, Davis said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He had every right to. We had mocked him, disrespected him, treated him like he was less than nothing. But instead of crushing us, he taught us. Instead of humiliating us, he elevated us. He took 4 arrogant young fools and showed them what real strength looked like. He paused, Looking at the flag-draped coffin before him, real strength isn't about how steady your hands are, it's about how steady your character is. Real strength isn't about what you can do to others, it's about what you choose not to do, even when you have every justification. Walter Keane had the steadiest character of anyone I've ever known, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what he taught me. The rifles fired their final salute, the flag was folded and presented, and somewhere, in the hearts of everyone who had known him, Walter Keane's legacy lived on. Not as a legendary sniper, though he was certainly that. Not as a record holder or medal winner, though those accomplishments were real. But as a man who understood that every person carries hidden depths, that trembling hands can still achieve greatness, and that the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies but in transforming them into allies. The next time you see someone who seems weak, who appears diminished, who looks like they have nothing left to offer the world, pause before you judge. Pause before you mock. Pause before you dismiss. Because you might be looking at a master. You might be looking at a hero. You might be looking at someone whose shaking hands could teach your steady ones more than you ever imagined possible. If this story reminded you that true strength comes from character, not appearance, subscribe to my channel for more stories of quiet heroes and hidden legends. And remember, the hands that shake the most might just be the ones that change the world.